Today in Fulchester Crown Court, proceedings continue against Mrs. Sheena Smithson, charged with attempting to murder her 14-month-old son. Central to the prosecution's case is the claim that she is given to moods of uncontrollable passion. The defence has brought medical evidence to dispute this, but yesterday proceedings had to be abruptly adjourned because Sheena broke down under cross-examination and tried to run from the court.
And I think that last remark was quite uncalled for, Miss Tate. Members of the jury, innocent or guilty, the accused inevitably is bound to have certain apprehensions about the possible consequences of this case. And I refer to the threat to her parental rights, and she is the mother of 3 children. Now, no doubt the prosecution will want to hold up yesterday's incident as an example of the accused's potential for violence. And it is up to you to make up your own minds whether or not you agree with that. But I will not tolerate any more displays such as necessitated yesterday's adjournment. Is that understood, Miss Tate?
I apologize, my lord.
Very well. Now let's get on.
Now, Mrs. Smithson, whilst heeding his lordship's observations of your conduct in court yesterday, I still feel I must question you on your behaviour whilst on remand.
Yes.
How would you describe your relationship with the prison officers whilst you were on remand?
All right, but they didn't understand.
All right. Were you not put under sedation as a result of a quarrel with a prison officer?
She should never have said that.
And did you not then try to abscond from the prison?
Yes.
Speak up, please.
Yes.
And do you not agree that this incident could be construed as yet another example of your tendency to lose control under pressure and resort to violence?
My lord, as has already emerged in evidence, the defendant was under the most unreasonable stress in prison. No one forthcoming with a surety for bail, consistently denied all contact with her children.
Miss Tate?
Perhaps so, my lord. But then surely the jury should be allowed to know of the incident, so that, as his lordship said regarding Mrs. Smithson leaving the court yesterday, they may be allowed to judge for themselves.
Yes, but they must...
Very well. And now, since the jury has heard both your points of view, let's leave it at that, shall we?
Mrs. Smithson, if we could go over your version of how Peter's injuries occurred. Now, you say that things were pretty chaotic that afternoon.
Yes.
And amongst other things, the television set was faulty.
Yes.
In what way?
The picture kept coming and going.
Well, there was nothing wrong with the sound.
No.
Now, you see, I find this very strange, that if the sound was functioning correctly, as you say, you could still hear the closing of a car door. A car way down the street and 4 stories down.
What?
It was raining, so presumably the windows were closed.
Ah, well, no, you see, the kitchen looks out over the balcony, so the windows are sheltered. I was able to have them open.
Oh, how fortunate.
And the door through to the living room was closed, so I could hear the car outside.
I see. So you were filling the washing machine, and then you went out onto the balcony and looked over.
Yes.
And no sooner had you got out there than your eldest daughter, Fiona, who moments before you'd left, shut in the living room with the television set on, Fiona came out to you and told you that the kitchen was flooded.
Oh, I don't remember for sure. Maybe it was the television she came about.
You don't remember?
It was the telly.
The television and not the flooding that you described to us earlier.
Aye.
So, in fact, when you went back in to adjust the television set, as you now tell us, you wouldn't have had this rush, this sense of urgency that you described to us before.
Well, you see, the kitchen opens out onto the front hall, so as I came back into the telly, I was able to see the mess.
In the kitchen?
Aye.
So you're coming in and seeing the mess in the kitchen, that was what made you forget to close the door. Now, that's the new version that you're telling us now.
That's how it was.
You're sure?
Yes.
Well, I put it to you, madam, that is not how it was at all.
Oh?
Mrs. Smithson, you say that you panicked when you saw young Peter falling down the stairs, and yet with an unconscious baby in your arms and 2 very upset little girls, you were still able to shut the door and chain it as you returned into the flat. It was chained when your mother-in-law arrived a few moments later. Mrs. Smithson, you never heard a car door slam, and you never went onto the balcony.
I did so.
It had been a terrible day, and you were at your wits' end. You were filling the washing machine when suddenly the television set lost its picture, and the children started screaming. You dashed in to see what was wrong and adjust the set, but no sooner had you done this Then returned to the kitchen, and you saw that that was flooded with water.
No.
You were furious. But before you could clear it up, the children were shouting again. You went back in, and there was young Peter, who had vomited all over himself and the living room floor.
No.
It was too much. You lost control.
I didn't.
And the next thing you knew, young Peter was lying on the floor unconscious.
Lies.
He was unconscious, Mrs. Smithson, and in your hand was one of the heavy building blocks from the corner or a heavy kitchen implement.
Are you all right?
If I could just take some water, please. Thank you. Thank you. I'm fine now.
Very well. Miss Tate?
My lord? Well, Mrs. Smithson, do you deny that's how it really happened?
I do.
You're still clinging to your tattered version of car door slamming and all that?
You really think a mother could lose control, like you said, strike her own baby?
Well, that's what I'm saying, Mrs. Smithson.
You're not a mother yourself, are you? Are you?
Mrs. Smithson, you will confine yourself to answering questions.
It's just if she was. If she'd ever been a mother with love for her children, she'd know.
Know what? That you gained some sort of miraculous forbearance?
You'd know the feeling of having a life grow inside of you, the wonder of it. But you, being in a profession, a career of your own, you couldn't know. But when you're just a housewife, when you've had your marriage fail, then the one thing that you do still have are your babes. Their limbs are right. They haven't turned out Mongols or subnormals. They're whole and perfect and lovely. The one thing that hasn't failed. You don't ever hurt them, Miss Tate. That's the last thing. The very last.
Well, if we could just return to the case again, Mrs. Smithson, you do have moods.
Yes.
Black moods of hate when you hate even yourself.
But never them.
Mrs. Smithson, I put it to you that you acted on an impulse of uncontrollable passion. A passion of which an obsessive personality such as you have displayed for us would be fully capable.
No.
No further questions.
Mr. Lotterby, do you wish to re-examine?
No, my lord, thank you.
You may return to the dock.
Thank you.
My last witness, my lord, is the social worker, Miss Alison James.
Alison James, please. Will you come this way?
Miss James, it was you who interviewed the defendant on her first visit to the Social Services Department in April.
Yes, it was.
Would you tell us about it, please?
She explained to me how things were at home, how cut off she felt, the grotty place they were in, the trouble with her husband and his mother and so on. Well, at first I wasn't too sure how we could help, so I asked her to wait while I checked with the director.
And Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Do you know what he did?
Yes, he told me to tell her to get in touch with the infants clinic.
And did you do that?
Well, yes.
How did you respond?
She was pretty fed up. Well, naturally. As far as I remember, we exchanged some remarks about the great welfare state, the lack of facilities and so on.
Nothing else?
I think I said if she wanted any help from us, she'd be better to come in and throw a fit or something, start rolling on the floor, threaten suicide. I was pretty bitter, I suppose.
And then what happened?
Well, the next thing was about a month later. Mr. Webster called me in and asked me to start home visits with the family.
Did he tell you why his attitude had changed?
That she'd been getting violent with the youngest child, yes.
Did this surprise you?
Well, yes, at first, very much. But then when I started the visits, I thought it was something she'd just made up to get some action.
Something she just made up to get some action. I see. Now, how many of these visits did you actually make?
About 10, usually for a couple of hours or so, unless the husband was at home.
Oh, what happened then?
Well, then I was in and out of the place in about 10 minutes. He resented my being there.
I see. And during the course of these visits, what conclusions did you make concerning Sheena Smithson?
That she was an intelligent woman with a disastrous marriage.
And as a mother?
Devoted. Dedicated. She'd obviously decided to compensate for the marital mess by making something of the children.
And you respected her for this?
Oh, yes. It was all loaded against her. Her husband, his dreadful mother, a council flat totally unsuited for a family with 3 young children.
So then what did you do?
Well, I went to Mr. Webster and I asked him to put pressure on the housing people. It was the only possible way we could help, really.
And how did he respond?
He refused point blank. We had a hell of a row about it.
And then?
I told him I wanted a transfer.
I see.
There were other issues, of course, but that was the one that brought it to a head.
Now, Miss James, when you heard that Sheena Smithson was being charged with attempting to murder her son, what did you do?
Well, I was absolutely staggered, of course. And then, naturally, as soon as I could, I went and visited her in prison. Of course, I'd realised all along how there was a lot of jealousy, hatred even on the part of the mother-in-law. And then when I saw Sheena in prison and heard all the circumstances, well, it seemed obvious. It was her, the mother-in-law, who'd pointed the finger and started this witch hunt against Sheena.